They were sentenced to die, but their deaths didn't go as planned. Some gasped for air for nearly 2 hours. Others burst into flames. Needles missed veins, hearts kept beating, and families watched in horror as executions turned into nightmares. These are not urban legends. They are real, documented failures of the American death penalty system. And tonight you'll hear every chilling detail. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories, chilling execution details, and criminal justice breakdowns. Hit the notification bell so you never miss what's next. Clayton Lockett, Oklahoma, 2014. On April 29, 2014, the state of Oklahoma attempted to carry out the execution of Clayton Darrell Lockett, a man convicted of the brutal 1999 murder of 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman. Lockett and his accomplices had kidnapped Neiman during a home invasion. She was shot, buried alive, and left to die in a shallow grave. The crime was as senseless as it was horrifying, and Lockett was sentenced to death in 2000. But when the day of justice arrived, the execution itself became a national scandal, widely regarded as one of the most botched executions in modern American history. The execution began at 6:23 p.m. inside Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The state was using a new untested 3-drug cocktail: midazolam, a sedative, vecuronium bromide, a paralytic, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. Midazolam had already drawn criticism for its failure to deeply sedate inmates in prior executions, but Oklahoma pressed forward. The problem began almost immediately. The IV line inserted into Lockett's groin was improperly placed, allowing the drugs to leak into the surrounding tissue instead of his bloodstream. This caused a blown vein, preventing the drugs from working as intended. Initially, Lockett was declared unconscious at 6:33 p.m., but moments later, he began convulsing, writhing against the restraints, clenching his teeth, struggling to speak, and lifting his head off the gurney. His body appeared to fight the paralysis, and witnesses, including journalists and attorneys, watched in shocked silence as the execution dragged on. Instead of slipping quietly into death, Lockett groaned, gasped, and visibly suffered for 43 long minutes. Officials eventually closed the blinds to the witness chamber as medical staff scrambled to assess the situation. At 7:06 p.m., a prison official called off the execution, but it was too late. Lockett died of a massive heart attack at 7:06 p.m. The governor's office, the Department of Corrections, and the public were left reeling. Last meal hours before his scheduled execution, Lockett was served his last meal: a 12-ounce of steak, baked potato, fried okra, pecan pie, and a Diet Coke. But in an unexpected move, he refused to eat any of it. Whether it was anxiety, protest, or simply resignation, his untouched plate sat as a final reminder of a man awaiting an end he may have suspected would not come peacefully. Final words. As he lay strapped to the gurney, moments before the drugs entered his body, Lockett muttered, "Man, I'm not afraid to die." But what followed suggested otherwise, not from fear but from sheer agony. Within minutes of that statement, his body twitched violently, and he attempted to speak, though his words were unintelligible. One witness described the scene as torture in real time. The Lockett execution sparked an immediate national uproar. Human rights organizations, legal scholars, and media outlets condemned Oklahoma's handling of the case. Then President Barack Obama called the incident deeply troubling and ordered a federal review of the use of lethal injection drugs. It was later revealed that the state had sourced its execution drugs from a compounding pharmacy with questionable oversight, and the execution team lacked sufficient training. Oklahoma paused all executions for years following the incident and faced multiple lawsuits, including from death row inmates who feared similar fates. Angel Nieves Diaz, Florida, 2006. On December 13, 2006, the state of Florida carried out the execution of Angel Nieves Diaz, a 55-year-old Puerto Rican man convicted in the 1979 shooting death of Miami nightclub manager Joseph Nagy. Despite Diaz's repeated claims of innocence, the state proceeded with the execution at Florida State Prison in Rayford. What unfolded that evening would become one of the most visibly disturbing executions in U.S. history and a flashpoint in the debate over lethal injection protocols in America. Florida used a 3-drug lethal injection protocol: sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to paralyze the muscles, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. But a critical error occurred. The IV line was not properly inserted into Diaz's vein. Instead, the drugs were injected into the surrounding soft tissue, where they failed to circulate effectively. The consequences were gruesome and highly visible. Diaz began to grimace, squirm, and move his mouth as the drugs slowly seeped through his body. He appeared to remain partially conscious, despite the sedative being administered. Instead of the usual 7 to 10 minute death window, it took 34 excruciating minutes for Diaz to die. Witnesses watched as he moved on the gurney, blinked, and opened his mouth as if trying to speak. According to autopsy results, his arm showed chemical burns from the misplaced injection. The botched procedure shocked both witnesses and prison staff and left even seasoned journalists visibly shaken. Last meal, Angel Nieves Diaz declined the traditional final meal. Instead, he ate the standard prison food served to all inmates on execution day. His refusal to make a special request was seen by some as an act of quiet resistance or perhaps a reflection of his continued assertion of innocence. Final words. Strapped to the gurney, with the IV lines inserted and witnesses watching from behind the glass, Diaz gave one final statement in Spanish, translated as, "I want everyone to know I did not kill the man. I'm innocent. I leave you with that." Unlike many inmates who give apologies or ask for forgiveness, Diaz held firm, proclaiming his innocence until his last breath. The reaction was swift and harsh. The execution was widely condemned by human rights advocates, legal scholars, and medical professionals. Then Governor Jeb Bush suspended all executions in Florida just 2 days later and appointed a commission to review the state's lethal injection procedures. The case exposed glaring flaws in Florida's execution methods, namely unqualified personnel, poorly maintained equipment, and a lack of medical oversight. The botched killing of Angel Nieves Diaz raised serious questions about the humaneness and legality of lethal injection protocols, not only in Florida, but nationwide. Joseph Wood, Arizona, 2014. On July 23, 2014, inside the death chamber at Arizona State Prison in Florence, a man named Joseph Rudolph Wood III became the center of one of the most prolonged and controversial executions in modern American history. What was meant to be a swift, state-sanctioned death became a nearly 2-hour-long spectacle of gasping, twitching, and visible suffering, all in front of a stunned audience. Wood was convicted of the 1989 double murder of his ex-girlfriend, Deborah Dietz, and her father, Eugene Dietz, in Tucson, Arizona. The killings occurred inside a family-run automotive shop, where Wood burst in and shot both victims in cold blood. The motive? Deborah had broken up with him and was moving on with her life. He was sentenced to death in 1991. On the day of his execution, Wood was injected with a 2-drug combination, midazolam, a sedative that was supposed to render him unconscious, and hydromorphone, a powerful opioid that stops respiration and ultimately the heart. But the drugs did not work as intended. At 1:52 p.m., the injection began. What followed horrified everyone present. Joseph Wood gasped for air over 600 times during a 1-hour and 57-minute ordeal. Reporters counted each breath. One wrote that he looked like a fish on shore gulping for air. Instead of slipping into unconsciousness, Wood remained visibly responsive, his stomach heaving, chest rising, mouth opening and closing rhythmically in what some described as agonized panting. Even 30 minutes in, he was still breathing, his body fighting for life. The state had to administer 15 separate doses of drugs to finally stop his heart, 15 times the intended amount. Yet the state claimed he never suffered, describing his movements as snoring. That characterization was contradicted by multiple witnesses, including Associated Press reporter Brian Skoloff, who said, "It was the most prolonged execution I've ever witnessed. This was anything but peaceful or humane." The execution was only declared complete at 3:49 p.m., nearly 2 hours after it began. Last meal. Unlike other states, Arizona does not allow customized last meals. Instead, Joseph Wood was given the standard breakfast fare on execution day, pancakes and oatmeal, a quiet, ordinary meal that gave no indication of the chaos to follow. Final words. Shortly before the drugs entered his system, Joseph Wood spoke aloud to the witnesses behind the glass, offering a haunting and spiritually charged message. God forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. A direct echo of Jesus' words from the cross in Luke 23:34, his final statement added a layer of solemnity to a moment that would soon become one of the most heavily criticized executions in recent memory. The public and legal fallout from Joseph Wood's botched execution was immediate. Civil rights organizations, medical professionals, and legal advocates condemned the state's use of midazolam, citing previous failures in other states, including Oklahoma and Ohio. Lawsuits were filed. Arizona's execution protocol came under intense scrutiny. Even Republican Senator John McCain, a former prisoner of war, called the execution torture. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, just days before the execution, had halted it over concerns about transparency with the drugs used, but the Supreme Court overturned that stay, allowing the execution to proceed. After the botched death, Arizona halted executions for 7 years, not resuming them until 2022. The event further fueled national debates about the future of capital punishment in the United States and the ethical use of experimental drug protocols. Romel, Broom, Ohio, 2009. On September 15, 2009, the state of Ohio attempted to execute Romel Broom, a man convicted of the 1984 kidnapping, rape, and murder of 14-year-old Trina Middleton. The crime was brutal, and Broom had spent over 2 decades on death row. But on the day his sentence was to be carried out, what unfolded was not an execution, it was a state-sanctioned medical disaster. At 1:30 p.m., executioners began the process of administering lethal injection, but something quickly became clear. They could not locate a viable vein. For the next 2 hours, prison staff and medical technicians stabbed at Broom's arms, hands, legs, and ankles, repeatedly trying and failing to insert an IV line. The scene became increasingly chaotic as Broom, in visible distress, winced, groaned, and even tried to help by turning on his side and pointing out usable veins. At one point, he covered his face with both hands, crying out in pain and frustration. As the minutes turned into hours, a visibly shaken execution team had to admit defeat. At 2:45 p.m., then Governor Ted Strickland issued a stay of execution. Romel Broom was wheeled off the gurney and returned to his death row cell, alive. This was the first time in U.S. history that an execution had been halted mid-procedure after the process had already begun. Last meal earlier that day, Broom had requested steak, fried shrimp, French fries, Pepsi, but due to the trauma and failure of the attempted execution, he never received the meal. Instead of being served his final food, he was returned to his cell with visible puncture wounds and bruises, a man still sentenced to die, but very much alive. Last words. Though no official last words were recorded, witnesses and prison staff later recalled that during the failed procedure, Broom turned to the executioners and said, "Can you believe this is happening?" It was a moment that captured both the surreal nature of the event and the terrifying reality of a man experiencing a botched execution in real time. The failed execution set off a firestorm of legal debate. Could the state try again? Would a second attempt be considered cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, or double jeopardy under the Fifth? Broom and his legal team filed lawsuits claiming that a second attempt would violate the Constitution, arguing that no person should be subjected to 2 attempts at state-sponsored death. Ohio pushed back. In 2016, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that the state could lawfully try to execute him again, setting the stage for a potentially unprecedented second attempt. However, the execution was never rescheduled. Romel Broom remained on death row until December 28, 2020, when he died of suspected COVID-19 complications or cancer at the age of 64. In the end, despite decades on death row and a failed attempt at lethal injection, Romel Broom died of natural causes, never executed by the state that had tried and failed to kill him. John Wayne Gasey, Illinois, 1994. Few names strike fear and revulsion like that of John Wayne Gasey, the man who became known across America as the Killer Clown. Convicted of the rape, torture, and murder of 33 young men and boys, Gasey buried many of his victims beneath his suburban home in Norwood Park Township, Illinois. By the time his crimes were discovered in 1978, he had already become one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. His capture sent shockwaves through the nation, but his execution in 1994, the first in Illinois in decades, would end in unsettling fashion, marking yet another dark chapter in the story of his crimes. On the night of May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was strapped to a gurney inside Stateville Correctional Center. Illinois officials were prepared to administer a 3-drug lethal injection using a protocol similar to other states: a sedative, a paralytic, and a drug to stop the heart. But almost immediately, something went wrong. As the drugs began to flow, the IV line became clogged. Witnesses inside the execution chamber heard a loud thumping noise, as if pressure were being applied to force the chemicals through the blocked tubing. The execution team scrambled behind the scenes, attempting to clear the blockage. The blinds were temporarily drawn closed while adjustments were made. Instead of lasting the usual 7 to 10 minutes, the execution took nearly 18 minutes to complete. While not as visibly agonizing as other botched executions, the delay and mechanical failure added a disturbing and ironic footnote to the life and death of one of America's most notorious killers. State officials insisted Gacy was unconscious the entire time and did not suffer. But observers were deeply unsettled by the delay and the technical failure of what was supposed to be a controlled, sterile process. The incident prompted criticism and a brief moratorium on executions in Illinois to reevaluate procedures. Gacy's last meal was as overindulgent and theatrical as the man himself: a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken, a nod to his past. He once managed 3 KFC franchises, French fries, 12 fried shrimp, and a full pound of strawberries. Some saw the order as symbolic, a final attempt by Gacy to maintain control and indulgence, even in death. Final words. When asked if he had any last words before the chemicals entered his body, John Wayne Gacy sneered and spoke just 3 words: "Kiss my ass." There was no apology, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the 33 lives he had taken. Instead, Gacy's final words were a cold, calculated act of defiance, a final show of dominance from a man who had inflicted decades of suffering. Gacy's death did not bring peace to many of the victims' families. Several of them attended the execution and described a strange emptiness afterward. As one father said, "He got an easier death than any of our sons did." The botched nature of his execution, though minor compared to others, reignited debates in Illinois over lethal injection, death penalty ethics, and procedural competency. In the years that followed, Illinois would go on to abolish the death penalty in 2011, citing errors, wrongful convictions, and the fallibility of the justice system. Gacy's case, alongside several other high-profile capital punishment failures, played a role in that historic shift. Doyle Lee Ham, Alabama, 2018, attempted execution. On the night of February 22, 2018, the state of Alabama made a grim attempt to execute Doyle Lee Ham, a convicted murderer and longtime death row inmate. But what unfolded inside the death chamber was not an execution. It was a prolonged, painful, and ultimately aborted medical ordeal that became one of the most disturbing cases of a botched execution in recent U.S. history. In 1987, Doyle Ham was convicted of the robbery and murder of motel clerk Patrick Cunningham in Coleman County, Alabama. Ham shot the victim in the head during a robbery, fled the scene, and was later apprehended. He was sentenced to death that same year and would spend over 30 years on death row. But by the time his execution date was set, Ham was no longer the same man who had entered prison decades earlier. He was battling advanced cranial and lymphatic cancer, had compromised veins, and was receiving treatment for terminal illness. Despite clear warnings from Ham's doctors and attorneys about his fragile medical state, Alabama pushed forward with the lethal injection. What followed was a medical catastrophe. For over 2.5 hours, the state's execution team jabbed Ham repeatedly in the legs, ankles, feet, groin, and even near his bladder, in a desperate attempt to find a vein suitable for inserting the IV. All the while, Ham was in visible pain, flinching and moaning as he lay strapped to the gurney. Multiple attempts failed, veins collapsed, blood flowed, and still no proper IV access could be established. At one point, according to court records and Ham's later statements, the team tried to insert a catheter through his groin, an excruciating and invasive move that left him bleeding and bruised. The execution was ultimately called off, an extremely rare occurrence. At approximately 11:27 p.m., the prison's warden made the decision to halt the procedure and return Ham to his cell. He had survived his own execution. Last meal. Earlier that day, Ham was served his planned final meal: a beef patty, rice, turnip greens, cornbread. Unlike many other death row inmates, Ham did not decline the meal, though reports indicate he ate little. Perhaps he sensed that the night would not unfold as the state had intended. Last words. Because the execution was never initiated successfully, Ham was not given the opportunity to make a final statement. The team never reached the point of reading his death warrant or prompting for last words. As a result, no official final words were recorded. The aftermath of the botched execution attempt was swift and deeply embarrassing for Alabama. Ham's legal team filed emergency motions and sought federal intervention. A sworn medical examination in the days that followed documented numerous puncture wounds, deep bruising, and severe internal trauma. Photos revealed blackened, swollen limbs and multiple failed injection sites. Amnesty International condemned the event, calling it torture under the guise of justice. Eventually, the state of Alabama reached a settlement with Ham's legal team. The state agreed never to attempt to execute him again. Doyle Lee Ham died on death row on November 28, 2021, from cancer-related complications, not by state execution, but from the very illness that had made his execution so medically perilous in the first place. Charles Walker, Illinois, 1990. On September 12, 1990, Charles Walker became the first person executed in Illinois in nearly 3 decades, and the first since the state resumed capital punishment after the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. But what was supposed to be a textbook gas chamber execution soon turned into a grim example of human error and mechanical failure, leaving behind unsettling questions about competence, suffering, and the true cost of state executions. Charles Walker had a long criminal record, but it was the 1983 double murder that sealed his fate. He shot and killed 24-year-old Kevin Pauley and his 21-year-old girlfriend Sharon Winker during a robbery in southern Illinois. The killings were cold and deliberate, and Walker showed no remorse. He was sentenced to death and became one of the rare inmates who fought against further appeals, saying he was ready to die and wanted no part in prolonging the process. But the method the state used to end his life would prove far more disturbing than expected. The state of Illinois used lethal gas, specifically hydrogen cyanide, administered inside a sealed gas chamber. The process is supposed to be swift. The prisoner is strapped to a chair, a container of sulfuric acid is placed beneath, and cyanide pellets are dropped in to create the gas, which quickly incapacitates the lungs and heart. At 12:11 a.m., the process began. But almost immediately, something went wrong. A technician forgot to open the valve that allowed the gas to flow properly. For several minutes, the chemical reaction was delayed, meaning the gas built up without circulating efficiently. As a result, Walker's death took longer than normal, and it was not as quiet as expected. Witnesses reported that his breathing became loud and erratic, with gasping sounds echoing through the sealed chamber. His body remained upright for longer than expected before finally slumping forward, motionless. It was a chilling reminder that even the most planned executions can fall apart due to small, human mistakes that have enormous consequences when life and death hang in the balance. Last meal hours before his execution, Charles Walker was served his chosen last meal: fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, and a slice of lemon meringue pie. Unlike many on death row who struggled to eat on their final day, Walker reportedly finished the entire meal calmly. Final words. As he was led into the chamber, Charles Walker offered no apologies or elaborate goodbyes. Instead, he looked directly at the witnesses and said, "Let's get this over with." A final statement that reflected his hardened demeanor and his desire to die on his own terms, despite the state's fumbling efforts to carry it out. Although not as visibly gruesome as other botched executions, Walker's case became a key example of why gas chamber executions were rapidly falling out of favor in the U.S. The mechanical delay, combined with the audible distress, shook observers and added to the growing body of criticism against older execution methods. Within a few years, Illinois would abandon gas chamber executions entirely. And decades later, in 2011, the state would abolish the death penalty altogether, citing concerns about wrongful convictions and inhumane practices. Stephen McCoy, Texas, 1989. In the history of American executions, Stephen McCoy's death stands out not for its method, but for its visceral horror. On May 24, 1989, Texas carried out McCoy's execution by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. But rather than a quiet, sterile death, what witnesses saw that day was a man thrashing, gasping, and convulsing, a disturbing spectacle that shook even hardened observers and raised serious concerns about the reliability of the execution process. Stephen McCoy had been convicted of the 1981 abduction, rape, and murder of a 20-year-old woman named Cynthia Johnson. Along with an accomplice, McCoy kidnapped the victim, drove her to a remote area, and subjected her to unspeakable brutality before ending her life. He was sentenced to death in 1983. The nature of his crime left little sympathy in the public eye, but the manner of his execution brought unexpected discomfort, even to those who supported capital punishment. Texas used a standard 3-drug lethal injection protocol, a sedative to induce unconsciousness, a paralytic agent to stop muscle movement, and a final drug to stop the heart. McCoy was strapped to the gurney and the drugs were administered. But what happened next horrified everyone in the room. Instead of quickly falling unconscious, McCoy began to gasp violently. His body convulsed with force, his chest heaved repeatedly, and his back arched off the gurney. Some witnesses described it as if he were fighting against the drugs, his body unwilling to submit. Reporters who attended said it was the most disturbing execution they had ever witnessed. Even state officials acknowledged afterward that something had gone wrong. Though never officially classified as a botched execution by the state, eyewitness reports and internal corrections staff later confirmed that McCoy's death had not proceeded as planned. It was later speculated that the sedative had either failed to take effect or had not been administered correctly, resulting in him possibly being conscious during the remainder of the execution. Last meal hours before he was led to the death chamber, McCoy requested a final meal that was modest and almost childlike in its simplicity. 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, a chocolate milkshake. There were no reports of him refusing or delaying the meal. In fact, some prison staff noted he seemed unusually calm until the moment came. Final words. With his arms strapped down and the IV in place, Stephen McCoy turned to the room filled with witnesses and said, "I deserve this." It was a rare expression of accountability, a final admission from a man who had committed unspeakable acts. But what followed his words would be anything but just or peaceful. Jesse Taffero, Florida, 1990, electric chair. On May 4, 1990, Jesse Joseph Taffero was strapped into Florida's electric chair, known grimly as Old Sparky. His execution was supposed to be swift, clinical, and final. Instead, it became one of the most infamous botched executions in U.S. history, as flames erupted from his head in front of a room of horrified witnesses. It was an event that reignited public debate over the use of the electric chair and cast a dark shadow over Florida's death penalty system. Taffero had been convicted of the 1976 murders of 2 Florida law enforcement officers, Highway Patrol Trooper Philip Black and visiting Canadian Constable Donald Irwin. The officers were shot at a rest area after finding firearms in the car Taffero was in. He, his girlfriend Sonia Sonny Jacobs, and another man were arrested after a high-speed chase. While Taffero maintained that he wasn't the one who fired the fatal shots, the prosecution convinced a jury otherwise. He was sentenced to death, while his co-defendant, Walter Rhodes, received a lighter sentence after testifying against Taffero in exchange for a deal, despite later recanting much of his testimony. Taffero spent over a decade on death row maintaining his innocence, supported by advocates who point to unreliable evidence and conflicting statements. Taffero's execution at Florida State Prison began at 7:07 a.m. As the first jolt of 2,000 volts of electricity surged through his body, something went terribly wrong. Flames, literal fire, erupted from the mask covering his face, shooting several inches into the air. Witnesses saw smoke billow from his head. His body convulsed violently, and a nauseating stench of burning flesh filled the chamber. It took 3 separate jolts of electricity and over 7 minutes before Taffero was declared dead. Execution team members, visibly shaken, quickly drew the blinds partway through to shield the horror from witnesses. One journalist present later said it was like watching a man burn alive in real time. The cause of the fire? A synthetic sponge. Investigators discovered that prison officials had used a synthetic sponge rather than the required natural sea sponge. Natural sponges conduct electricity evenly. Synthetic ones create resistance, resulting in overheating, fire, and extreme burns. This tragic oversight turned an already controversial method of execution into a national scandal. Last meal. Unlike many on death row, Jesse Taffero declined a special last meal. He ate only what the rest of the prison population was served that day, standard fare from the cafeteria. The choice, some believe, reflected a man resigned to injustice rather than celebration or ritual. Final words. As he sat strapped into the electric chair, minutes before the execution began, Jesse Taffero declared, "I'm innocent." He repeated this claim many times over the years, asserting that the actual shooter had escaped the death penalty through a plea deal. His final words would echo far beyond the death chamber. The gruesome nature of Taffero's execution drew immediate condemnation from media outlets, human rights organizations, and the general public. Florida came under fire not only for the execution itself, but for the lack of care and professionalism that led to it. In the years that followed, Taffero's co-defendant, Sonny Jacobs, was released after serving 17 years when evidence surfaced showing her trial had been tainted. Her release added further doubt about Taffero's guilt and fueled ongoing arguments that Florida may have executed an innocent man violently. The Taffero case became a turning point in the debate over the electric chair. Florida would later phase out electrocution as its primary method of execution, shifting to lethal injection in 2000, though inmates can still choose the chair under certain conditions. Jimmy Lee Gray, Mississippi, 1983, gas chamber. On September 2, 1983, the state of Mississippi carried out the execution of Jimmy Lee Gray, a convicted child killer whose death in the gas chamber would become one of the most gruesome and haunting examples of a botched execution in American history. What happened inside that sealed metal chamber was so disturbing that officials were forced to clear the witness room mid-execution, a rare and chilling moment that remains burned into the history of capital punishment. Jimmy Lee Gray was sentenced to death for the 1976 abduction, sexual assault, and murder of 3-year-old Duressa Jean Scales in Mississippi. At the time of the crime, Gray was already on parole for a previous murder, that of his 16-year-old girlfriend in Arizona. Despite his violent history, he had been released and within months took another life. The brutal nature of the child's murder made Gray one of the most reviled figures in Mississippi's prison system. The state prepared to execute him using hydrogen cyanide gas, a method that was already falling out of favor by the early 1980s due to its slow and visible suffering. Gray's execution took place in the Mississippi State Penitentiary gas chamber at Parchman. He was strapped to a chair inside the sealed room with a steel pole fixed behind his head. When the cyanide pellets dropped into the chamber's acid bowl, a chemical reaction released hydrogen cyanide gas, intended to suffocate him quickly. But the process did not go as planned. Instead of a silent, controlled death, Gray began gasping violently, struggling to breathe. He thrashed in his seat, and in a horrifying display, he repeatedly banged his head against the steel pole behind him, each sound echoing through the chamber and into the witness room. Witnesses later reported that the banging became rhythmic and desperate, as Gray slowly suffocated over the course of several minutes. His gasping breaths and thudding skull were so disturbing that officials ordered the witness room evacuated, an almost unprecedented move. One Associated Press reporter present at the execution later said, "Jimmy Lee Gray died banging his head against a steel pole in the gas chamber while reporters counted his moans. He reportedly moaned 8 times before falling silent. Last meal. Earlier that day, Gray was given his final meal, a hamburger, French fries. There is no record of whether he finished the food, but it was quite a final request in stark contrast to the chaos that would follow. Last words. No formal final statement was recorded, but witnesses say that as the gas filled the chamber, Gray could be heard softly muttering a single name, Shirlene. It was the name of his 16-year-old girlfriend, the first victim he had killed, as if his final thoughts were consumed by guilt, obsession, or both. These aren't just stories. They're haunting reminders of the flaws in a system meant to carry out justice with dignity. Each of these men faced the ultimate punishment, but the state's failure to execute them humanely continues to spark outrage, legal battles, and ethical debates. Whether you support or oppose the death penalty, these botched executions raise uncomfortable but necessary questions. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more raw, unfiltered true crime breakdowns, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, we shine a light on the dark corners of justice and injustice. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay informed, and never stop asking questions. See you in the next video.